I'm glad to see the irony. It was a terrible contract anyway. So as you all come back into the room and take your seats, I will just contextualize. I'll just contextualize this next segment. Robert Sikulak is an illustrator and an author. He's not a lawyer, he's not a regulator, and he's never been in that space. And I confess that although I am a big fan of comic books, I'd never heard of him until about 6 or 7 months ago when he released this amazing graphic novel called Terms and Conditions, which is really, really interesting. Now, I have it in my office, but I lent it out, so that was dumb. I should have been able to bring it today. But basically what he did was he took the 29,982 words of the iTunes Terms and Conditions, which are extremely tedious, and some of the most well-known, never-read end-user license agreements in the world, because everybody has one, and no one's read it, because it's so tedious. He took the text of the terms, and he turned them into speech bubbles in a graphic novel that's divided into different sort of imaginary parts. It's incredibly funky what he's done. There are no other words in that book except the ones that come straight from the iTunes Terms and Conditions and in sequence. And he's made it fit into these sort of 6 different chapters of interwoven fantasy stories with people all dressed like Steve Jobs. And it might sound funky, it is, but it's also fun. And it's really interesting because after that book came out, it's a bit of a bestseller. He's now on a book tour, that's why he couldn't be here today. More people have now read the Terms and Conditions of iTunes than ever before, thanks to Robert. So I think they should be thanking him or paying him, although I don't think they will. So because he couldn't be here today, we decided to do a very special format. I asked him 3 different questions, and then he filmed a response to those questions because we thought that would be a nice way. It's 1:45 in the morning where he is now. He has promised me he will stand by, so I'll get him on Skype when I finish talking. But still, let's see how this works out. So the first question I asked him was, that this graphic novels on iTunes, it's just such an eye-opener for end-user license agreements everywhere. What inspired it? Was it a conscious decision to start an end-user license agreement revolution? And his answer was really interesting, and here it is. And you'll notice in the background the novel is exactly.
Thanks for having me. My initial inspiration for this project was, in a way, the state of comics today. Especially in the United States, there's been an incredible growth of the variety of kinds of comics that are being made in terms of content, in terms of genre, in terms of the form. From web comics to graphic novels, and many more permutations have arisen. And I grew up with newspaper comics and comic books, and that's usually the kind of work that I like to parody, but I wanted to sort of reach out and expand my horizons a little bit and play with different kinds of comic storytelling. So the challenge was really, for me, to make a new kind of comic. I usually adapt literary classics, as in my book, Masterpiece Comics, which will take long novels, like Crime and Punishment, and I'll boil them down to very short comics. So for instance, my Crime and Punishment is 10 pages long, and it's drawn in the style of a Batman comic book. So I try to be faithful to my source material, but I also like the visuals to sort of add an ironic element, an absurd element. So this project is in that realm, but it's an extension. I really wanted to make a long-form comic. That was my main goal when I first started thinking about what I should do. And when I was thinking of using a long text, because I like to adapt, I thought, what is a long text? And it popped in my head, the iTunes terms and conditions are a very, very long text. So I love the idea of taking something very long. And also, like a lot of the novels that I've adapted, it is very long, and people feel guilty that they haven't read it. So that amused me, that it had some connection to what I was doing previously. But in this case, the idea was not to condense it, but to use all of the text and include every word. But what was really kind of liberating about it was, because the terms are very dry and repetitive, people don't have an emotional attachment to them, and also there is no plot, there's no character that people identify with or love. So it gave me a lot of freedom, because I didn't have to feel obligated to illustrate the text as it exists. Instead, I was able to sort of add visuals that had no apparent connection to the text. And as I say, that was very liberating. I decided early on that I wanted every page to be in the style of a different famous comic. So I've chosen comics from over 100 years of comic books and web comics and so forth, and I've redrawn them, and I've dressed the main character in the Steve Jobs outfit. That was the other thing that got me very excited. By choosing the iTunes terms and conditions, I was able to take advantage of the fact that Apple's spokesman for so many years wore a very particular outfit, glasses, black turtleneck, jeans, and you can always recognize them. So I've dressed all of the characters in the story as Steve Jobs. They all have their own adventures, they all have their own stories, but they're all dressed as him. So as you read the book, you make the connection that it's one character going through all these adventures, although clearly sometimes he looks like a child, sometimes he looks like a monster, sometimes he looks like a Japanese samurai warrior, but in all of them he is reciting the text. So I think I hit upon something that people have really responded to, which has been great. And it was not my conscious decision to start a revolution of any kind, but I did want to shake up my own approach to comics. I'm grateful that people have responded to it so positively, and I do hope it will encourage people to think differently, no pun intended, but I want them to think differently about how they could make comics. And you could certainly do more of this kind of thing with legal agreements. Even as my comics visually reference other comics that you've seen, I'm also interested in seeing sort of how people can take the form farther. So from the conceptual angle, you can do a lot with the new texts, for sure.
So I find it really fascinating that he's coming at this not at all consciously to shake up the law, but he certainly is shaking up the law, because this is now one of the most read end-user license agreements in the world. So there you go. But he's just a comic book writer having fun with some legalese. And how many people can say that they're having fun with legalese? So this, well, some of us are. So the second question I asked him was whether he could see that sort of concept working for terms and conditions deliberately made to fit the format. And I really loved his answer. Because again, he's coming at it from a completely different angle, but I think you'll like the answer.
I absolutely think that this concept could work for terms and conditions that were created specifically to fit the format of comics. It's very different from what I had in mind, but there's a million permutations to play with, and I'd love to see them all. Part of the joke of my book was that the iTunes text was not made to be illustrated. And that was very liberating for me as someone who usually will illustrate a text very faithfully. In this case, I was able to approach it without feeling like I needed to be faithful to the fans of the original text. I could go my own way. Comics can get very literal sometimes. So you have to figure out ways to keep the reader interested and surprised. And I think by not worrying so much about the visuals and the text perfectly aligned, it gave me some latitude. One of the most fun responses to my terms and conditions book has been someone telling me, I was looking at the pictures and I got caught up in them, and then you made me read it. You made me read the text. So, you know, they wanted to appreciate it sort of as a visual art object, but they ended up sort of getting caught up in the narrative of the visuals, and that lured them into reading the text. So certainly any pictures combined with images, if they're provocative or you know, beautiful or even puzzling, you can really, they can sometimes pull the reader in, which I think is great. As far as like building it from scratch, I think you could definitely find a smart way to make the words and the pictures complement each other without getting too repetitive or too literal. But there are plenty of smart artists out there, and I'm sure there are smart lawyers. I don't know that many lawyers personally, but I'm sure there are also some smart lawyers who could hash out a way to do this really effectively.
So how wonderful is that? Even if I didn't want to read the text, you made me read it. So, a great way to get your clients to accidentally read what you're preparing, even if they may not want to. I think that's precious. But he didn't take my subtle hint to work with us on this, so so I pushed it further. And what's next for you? Will you work on something similar? And to this, he was a little bit more evasive.
I'm always working on more comics, and I'm always interested in finding new ways to tell stories in comics, or to relay information in comics. So I have a few projects I'm working on right now. I'm actually going to be doing an adaptation of Moby Dick, which is a novel I love dearly, and that people do have a real emotional attachment to. So that's going to be a difficult project, but I'm looking forward to doing that. My most recent book just came out this month. Is called The Unquotable Trump, and this is a different way of taking comics, a different way of taking real world elements into comics. This takes actual quotes from Donald Trump and puts them into parodies of different comic book genres, and it's a way of drawing attention to some of the more absurd, outrageous, offensive things he said. You know, I hope my work kind of is effective on a few different levels. I want it to be funny, but I do also want to make a point. I'm concerned about the philosophical and moral quandaries that are present in great literature and in, you know, presidents I don't agree with, and also in legal texts. So I will continue to make different comics and play with different forms. I would say the one last thing that I recently finished that I'm very proud of is I did a retelling of Homer's poem, The Iliad, the Greek epic poem, The Iliad. I've adapted it into the form of a puzzle comic strip that's very popular in America called The Jumble. So my version is both a word puzzle with cartoon images that also tells the entire narrative of the Iliad. So you have to solve the puzzles to understand the plot, but it is actually the whole plot of the story, condensed. But the point is that I love playing with different forms. I love playing with different visual ideas, and I'm not sure what my next project will be after Moby Dick, but it may be another agreement. It might be more political work. I'm not sure, but I certainly will not live long enough to do all of the things that inspire me and that you know, give me opportunities to play with the different forms.
So that was it from Robert Cypriac. I thought it was so much fun to hear him talk, because to me he's in his own silo and I'm in my silo, and I keep asking him questions to get him to talk about the way he uses modern comics, but that's not at all how he sees it. He's just doing comics. He just happens to be using legalese as a joke. So again, those silos, you know, the lawyer's perspectives and the comic so fabulous. So yeah, it was great to be able to share that with you. I'm still laughing at that. You made me read it, but. So to maintain the theme of the silos, I'm going to hand over now to Jennifer Goddard. Jennifer has a panel all to herself because we lost 2 speakers. Colette Brunswick has sent a video much in the same format as this one, and we'll play that one at the end of Jennifer's panel. But Jennifer Vickers, as I said this morning, is stuck in New Zealand, but she still managed, I mean, the glory of technology, she managed to film a film explaining some of the things she was going to do if she were here and send her attachments and just put it up on YouTube or whatever, and we are now able to play the film she recorded this morning when she couldn't get on her flight. I mean, I'm old enough to think that that's pretty cool. The young ones are probably going, yeah, so? Why isn't she just Zooming or tweeting or something? But yeah, so thank you very much. Do you want to come up here, Jennifer? We'll set up.
Have a chat to the person beside you and discuss who do you think would benefit from a comic or creative contract? Who are the main beneficiaries or who are the end users? Obviously with the comic that we were just seeing, maybe quite young people, but have a chat. Who do you think would benefit from this? Interactive in a few discussions here, okay? So, and it's, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes and then a couple of minutes back and a couple of minutes back. Is that okay? All right, so we just need a way of being able to sort of give a timeout and get started. Now, one thing I just have to warn you is I'm deaf and I have problems hearing, and I cannot, because I've only got hearing in one ear, I can't tell when anyone says anything. I've got no way of triangulating at all, so I just have to look to see who actually is speaking. Who are some people who benefit from this type of approach?
Me. But you don't want to read a contract.
Everyone?
Never want to read a contract. Okay, that's healthy.
But what are some examples of
people with English as not their first language, disability participants in events, things like that. Indigenous people when they want to have a contract that's more equal, so as they can put their view forward.
Yes. Anyone else?
Young people.
Young people? Yeah.
Time for supplies.
Time for suppliers? Yeah.
The business, the organisation.
The organisation itself, as in staff or the people writing the contract? And
So I mean, there's 2 sides to that contract, right? So it's not just the person who's reading it, but it's the company that
designing it.
that is the relationship is with.
Yeah, so what we found from this morning so far is that they've got to put a lot more thought into it than, you know, if that process took a year, you've got to actually put more thought into it. And the challenge now with iTunes T's and C's is that, you know, what happens if there's an update or a change. But nevertheless, I would also like to add people with learning difficulties. People have challenges in reading, dyslexia or learning difficulties, who are, you know, aren't able to absorb a lot of information. Now, I met Jenny about 15 years ago. She's just about to remind us. But she was the person in charge of IACCM for Australia and New Zealand, but we actually met 15 years ago when I taught her how to mind map. She's sort of she describes herself as a lawyer in a square peg in a round hole. But I'll just play Jenny first. Now, it's a little bit soft, unfortunately, because the sound's not that good, but you should be able to hear it.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this panel from Auckland, New Zealand. I'm really very disappointed that Air New Zealand have had plane troubles this morning and my flight was cancelled. And I'm bitterly disappointed not to be with you, but I've made this little video to at least share some of the ideas I would have been adding in the panel. If we can get me on through Skype, I will join the conversation that way as well. So, start point, I am standing in front of a Pohutakawa tree, which is the New Zealand Christmas tree. So I thought, on the basis I didn't have a BBC baby available to run across the back of the shot to distract you while I was talking, I thought we'd come outside, stand in the park, and show you that summer's finally arrived in New Zealand. So on to the business in hand. So just a quick introduction about me. So my name's Jenny Vickers. I am a lawyer for nearly 30 years, but if you ask me my age, I'll tell you I started when I was about 5. So contract commercial law has always been my speciality, and for a very long time I've been playing with ideas around using a more creative approach to deliver legal topics. So Jennifer Goddard and I worked together for probably 15 years now. In and around creative thinking, mind mapping, and trying to use mind mapping and other tools like that to better communicate complex messages. And so, of course, in the legal field, we've got very complex messages. So what I've picked out to show you, while Jennifer talks about mind mapping, I've given Camilla the links to 5 little videos that we made. Just wait for the helicopter to go past.
Maybe some planes are working.
So about 6 years ago, I made a series of videos for a program called Mioma, which is Making It On My Own. So this program was created by a woman in Auckland who wanted to better prepare young people for going into society, out of school, and then dealing with the minefield of being expected to be an adult after being expected to be a child. And so I was given the key legal issues that teenagers and young adults should know about, and we decided to make a series of videos. So Camilla will play as many of these as you have appetite for, but I think the key message was, this was 6 years ago, using virtually no technology. A good smart student mixed the video for us. I asked my friends who were TV and radio voices to help me with the soundtracks, and we used a whole bunch of free resources to create the story of Zeki Pard. So I think this is a nice illustration from 6 years ago of how much you could achieve by understanding your market and beating down the silos using a different approach. So I hope you enjoy the videos, and if I can come and join the conversation some more, I will. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of the conference. I may try and join my phone by sitting in the back of the room, but otherwise, hope all goes well, and I'm bitterly disappointed not to be with you. Thank you.
So I'm going to play a couple of videos I chose. And just be careful, it starts off really loud and it goes soft, the music, they haven't quite mixed it properly. I think I've fixed it, but just in case it frightens you, it'll be okay. So I've chosen a couple of videos, and what I want you to think of is, what are the underlying legal terminology that they're educating the young people with? Can you spot where they're actually, under the radar, or overtly, or under the radar, just sharing legal issues, terms and conditions, situations that a young person needs to be aware of?
Once upon a time, a young Kiwi lad named Zeki Pard was about to come of age. He was just 17. It's time for Zeki to set off into the wide world. But before he takes off, his mum and dad want a quick word. And now that you're turning 18, son, you can go drinking, you can have an air rifle without the need for a license. You can join the army. You can get tattoos and piercing, but I wouldn't say too much to your mum about that. And, actually, you're allowed to smoke, but I'd advise you not to do that because it'll make you quite sick and you might actually die. Now that you're
Sorry.
you do realise that you will be able to get married, but the other thing you must consider is that if you screw up, you will have to face the full force of the law. And very important, you can be bound by contracts. Keep that one in mind. You can make a will. Oh, you've got a long time to live down. You don't have to worry, but you can make a will. Remember, always tell the truth. And the last thing, if you are doing that, what you can do is you can join the police force if you want to consider that, but it can be a bit dangerous. So you be very, very careful, darling. Now Zeki's getting a little older. He's starting to spread his wings, get a bit of a social life, and a bit of an online social life at that. Zeki's seen some pretty hot pictures up on Flickr, and he wants to look good. So, he throws a few images up there. Trouble is, they weren't his. Zeki, have you seen the National Geographic? It's got my picture on it. How did it get there? What have you done, son?
Sorry. So here's Ziki gets a job.
Zeki's left home, and cash isn't quite so easy to come by. Now mum and dad aren't there. Zeki's keen to get an overnight and live out on his own somewhere. So he goes online to look for a place. To get the job, Zeki finds a place he likes the look of. So he heads off to meet the slowly dodging landlord. Suddenly he remembers his mum's advice about getting bound up in contracts. The land. Very good, Zeki. Very good.
Sorry. I didn't expect that to keep going.
Zeki's left home, and cash isn't quite so easy to come by now mum and dad aren't there to back him up. So he starts to have a hunt on TradeMe for a job. He spots one at Vodafone as a call centre operator. To get the job, Zeki needs a pretty hot CV, so he thinks a BCom would sound pretty good.
I've just read your CV and you look very interesting. Would you like to come in for an interview? Very good, Zeki. Very, very good indeed. I'm glad to see that you've got a BCom. Very, very good. But tell me, Zeki, have you ever been in trouble with the law?
No, of course not. I'm always a good boy.
Well, congratulations, Zeki. You're hired. You will start with a 12-month probation.
It's Zeki's first day on the job, manning the phones, and he gets a call from a rather illustrious person.
Hi, it's Paris here. Listen, I got the bill from last month here, and it's a $10,000 bill. I'm sure I spent more than that.
Guess what? You'll never guess who I had on the phone.